quiet archive record. Tonight, we're stepping into a slow unfolding. Settle in. Let the outside world dissolve and gently descend into tonight's world. Tonight, we step into a whistleblower-style claim about an alleged alien biology program based on the real-life testimony of a scientist as it has been shared online, and do a slow, careful, biological read of it. You will hear the story of a scientist pulled into a restricted lab, then guided through tissue handling, containment, and analysis of an organism the file calls an EBO. We will examine the claimed anatomy and physiology, body plan, organs, cell behavior, immune-like responses, and signs the author suggests point to engineering rather than evolution. We will also test the writing the way a skeptical lab would, where the details feel realistic, where they become conveniently vague, what would be hard to fake, and what evidence would be needed to move from a compelling narrative to a real biological assessment. This is Anatomy of an Alien. Chapter 1. First contact with the file. There is a particular kind of document that changes the temperature of a room, not because it proves anything, not because it settles an argument, but because it is written like someone who is tired and specific. The transcript you provided is a YouTube reading and commentary on what people online call the EBO file. EBO, Exo Biospheric Organism, a term that sounds clinical, harmless, like a label on a vial. And yet, in the folklore of the internet, EBO becomes another name for the thing that stands in the corner of the cultural imagination. The grey, the small body, the oversized eyes, the quiet witness to some late-night driving memory. Tonight is not a trial. No verdict will be delivered. Tonight is an autopsy of a story. Anatomy, in its simplest sense, is the study of parts. What is here? What is missing? What connects? The narrator in your transcript reads the text with a kind of wary patience. He pauses. He comments. He points out where the writing feels like a scientist, and where it feels like someone imitating one. That is the right posture for a file like this. Not belief, not dismissal, but inspection. The EBO file claims to be written by a molecular biologist recruited into a compartmentalized program. The writer describes interviews that begin like normal scientific screening, and then drift into something else. A lawyer, a thicker NDA, a sense that consent is not just a signature, but a long-term surrender of speech. If the story is fictional, it is not foolish fiction. It understands how real institutions feel. Real secrecy is rarely cinematic. It is usually boring, procedural, administrative. It is a chain of doors, a badge that works for one hallway but not the next, a calendar full of meetings where nothing is decided, a culture where you learn to stop asking certain questions out loud. The file uses that boredom as a hook. It describes early days spent reading dry reports, SOPs, PowerPoints, memos, not wonder, just orientation. And that detail matters because it matches the texture of real technical work. In many real labs, your first days are not discovery. They are compliance, training, safety, methods. You learn where the eye wash is. You learn the names of the solvents. You learn what not to touch. The transcript narrator notices the logistics. The scientists clean. No janitors. No outside maintenance staff walking through. That detail is not proof, but it is a realism hook. In a place that cannot tolerate outsiders, even cleaning becomes restricted. Not because it is glamorous, because it reduces risk. The file places the lab in a setting that sounds plausible. A basement, a restricted wing, inside a legitimate biomedical site. The hidden thing embedded in the ordinary thing. That is a classic structure. It is how many conspiracy stories are told. The extraordinary sitting beneath the fluorescent hum of the everyday. Then the writer does something clever. They warn the reader. They claim they will insert red herrings about personal details. They will be vague. They will be contradictory. Not about the science, but about themselves. This is presented as protection. If you are real, you hide your trail. If you are fictional, you also hide your trail. The warning works both ways. It grants the author a shield. If you find an inconsistency, they can say, "Yes, I did that on purpose." Still, the story proceeds, and it proceeds with a voice that wants to sound like a person who has done lab work. We should be careful here. There is a difference between being correct and being convincing. A convincing story can be built from textbooks, protocol manuals, and a few years of listening to scientists talk. The internet has made technical language cheap. You can buy plausibility by copying the surface of reality. So our job tonight is to look beneath the surface. The EBO file claims the facility has multiple biosafety levels. It claims there are different rooms for different kinds of work. Cell culture, assays, freezer storage, a protected area for higher risk materials. This sounds like a lab. It is not an impossible claim. It also claims limited internet access, an internal network, an intranet, information that flows inside but does not flow out. That also sounds like a secure workplace. So far, nothing supernatural. And that is part of why the story works. It delays the monster. It builds the hallway first. It builds the badge. It builds the forms. Then, gradually, it brings you to the body. But before we let it do that, we should name the kind of thing we are reading. This is not data. It is testimony. Testimony can be true. Testimony can be false. Testimony can be a mixture. And testimony, even when honest, can still be wrong. Because memory is not a recording. It is an interpretation. The file asks us to imagine a scientist under pressure, a person inside a maze of rules, a person who might be brilliant and still be manipulated, a person who might be sincere and still be misled. This is where the story begins to feel less like a claim about aliens and more like a claim about institutions. Because the most terrifying part of the file is not the organism. It is the idea that people can build a world inside a world and keep it running. So in chapter 1, we set our table. We learn how the story wants to be read. We learn what kind of realism it uses. We learn where it protects itself. And we notice something else. The narrator in your transcript does not behave like a preacher. He does not demand belief. He does not laugh it off either. He treats it like a story with texture. And that posture is the right beginning. Because we are not here to be recruited. We are here to observe. An observation, done slowly, is where myths either collapse or reveal the human fingerprints beneath them. Chapter 2. The program and the people. Now the file starts to show the outline of the alleged program, not in one clean paragraph, but in fragments, as if the author is choosing how much to give and when. Recruitment, they say, was not a simple job posting. It was a pull, a selection. They describe being approached through professional channels, then drawn through interviews that subtly shift in tone. At first, the questions are about skill, experience, competence. Then the questions become about temperament. How do you handle stress? How do you keep secrets? Have you ever spoken to journalists? Have you ever been in trouble? If you have spent time around real high-security work, this does not sound absurd. Clearance processes often care more about predictability than brilliance. A genius who talks too much is a liability. A careful person who follows procedure is safer. And this is one of the story's quiet provocations. It suggests that the most important trait in the program is obedience. The author describes a layered access model, compartmentalization. You are allowed to know only what you need. That model is real. It exists in many industries: defense, intelligence, corporate research. Compartmentalization is not proof, but it is plausible. The file also describes the social atmosphere: people who do not speak freely, people who correct each other, people who monitor tone. A workplace can teach you how to think, not by telling you what to believe, but by rewarding some kinds of speech and punishing others. This is another point where the story is about culture, because secrecy is not only locks, it is a set of habits. It is the way your voice drops when you say a name. It is the way you do not write certain words in an email. The writer claims there are multiple groups. Not everyone is a biologist. There are engineers. There are handlers. There are security personnel. There are managers who do not understand the science, but control the schedule. If you have ever worked in a large project, you recognize this. The people with the least technical knowledge can still hold the most power. They own the budget. They own access. They own the calendar. In real labs, this dynamic exists in smaller ways. In big programs, it becomes the whole atmosphere. The file suggests a program shaped by fear. Fear of leaks, fear of infection, fear of politics, and fear, once installed, becomes self-reinforcing. You tighten rules. Rules create friction. Friction creates mistakes. Mistakes create more fear. Even if aliens are not involved, that loop can happen. The narrator in your transcript occasionally breaks the spell by doing something very simple. He asks, what would this require? What would be the logistics? How many people? How much money? How long? These are not exciting questions, but they are the questions that separate story from infrastructure. One of the file's most important tricks is how it uses infrastructure. It describes mundane processes: shipping, cold storage, sample labeling, waste disposal. It is trying to convince you by making you imagine a normal Tuesday. Because if you can imagine a normal Tuesday in the program, then the extraordinary parts feel less impossible. The author also uses a certain rhythm. They give you a little, then they pull back. They mention that the organism is not a single species, or they imply there may be variants. Then they stop. They mention that certain colleagues believe something. Then they stop. This rhythm mimics how secrets are actually experienced. You hear hints, you see a door, you are told not to enter. So the writing can feel true because it imitates that feeling. But imitation is not evidence, so we keep our two hands on the railing. One hand holds plausibility, the other hand holds skepticism. Now we ask about motive. Why would someone leak this? The file presents the author as conflicted. They want to warn the world. They also want to protect themselves. They also seem to want to be believed. That combination is human. If the story is true, the author might be frightened. If the story is false, the author might be performing frightened sincerity. The internet has taught us that performance can look very real. But there is a deeper question. If a person truly worked inside a program like this, Would they leak in this way? A long post, technical details, no documents, no images, no verifiable names. It is possible, but it is also the easiest kind of leak to fabricate. When real leaks occur, they often bring artifacts: a photo, a PDF, a credential, a timestamp. Even then, artifacts can be faked, but artifacts raise the cost of lying. This file lowers the cost. It offers narrative. A narrative is the cheapest currency online. So Chapter 2 is where we build our first rule for the archive. We will not confuse realism with reality. A story can be full of true details and still be false in its central claim. And a story can be mostly wrong and still reveal something true about fear, about secrecy, about power. The EBO file might be a map to an alien, or it might be a map to how modern minds create aliens. Either way, we keep reading. Chapter 3, Anatomy, Claims on the Table. Now the organism steps closer, not as a jump scare, more like a slow reveal. The file describes biology. It describes tissue, cells, structures. It claims the organism has unusual anatomy, certain organs that do not match expectations, a body plan that feels engineered. The transcript narrator pauses here often. He tries to translate the claims into plain language. He sometimes admits he does not know, and that admission is important, because one of the dangers of technical writing is that it can hypnotize. If a sentence contains enough specialized words, the reader may assume it is true. But scientists do not accept sentences. They accept methods. They accept results. They accept replication. So as we move into the biological claims, we have to ask different questions. Not only does it sound right, but could we test it? The file claims the organism is adapted to a different environment. It implies different gravity, different radiation, different constraints. This is a familiar move in alien storytelling. You design the body to fit a world. The file also suggests something that is almost more unsettling. It implies the organism might be manufactured, printed, grown, assembled. This is where modern anxieties enter. Because in the 21st century, the scariest aliens are not monsters. They are products. We live in a world where biology is becoming programmable. Not fully, not easily, but enough that the idea exists. CRISPR is real. Synthetic biology is real. Lab-grown tissues are real. So the file uses real trends to make an impossible claim feel closer. But again, plausibility is not proof. The author describes a kind of hierarchy of access to the organism. Some people see more, some people see less. This also mimics real labs. Junior staff do not always get the full picture. They handle samples. They do not handle strategy. The file sometimes reads like a person who handled samples. It focuses on the tactile, the smell of a room, the texture of a protocol, the boredom of repeating assays. That tactile language is persuasive. It makes you feel present, but it can also be manufactured. A good writer can create tactile scenes. So we ask, what is the author's level of specificity? In some places, the file is extremely specific. It names categories of experiments. It suggests particular molecular pathways. It references immune responses. In other places, it becomes vague. It says things like, there was something unusual. It says, the results were shocking. This is a common feature of hoaxes: specificity where it is safe, vagueness where it would be falsifiable. Yet it is also a feature of honest testimony. A person remembers some things clearly, other things as impressions. So we look for patterns. One pattern is how the file frames risk. It claims the organism could be hazardous, biohazard, unknown pathogens. This is reasonable caution. If you truly had a non-terrestrial organism, you would treat it as hazardous. You would isolate, you would sterilize, you would monitor. But the file also uses hazard as emotional fuel. The idea that this thing could infect, could escape, could change us. That fear is ancient. It is the fear of contamination. And contamination stories are powerful because they are about boundaries. The boundary between human and not human. The boundary between clean and unclean. The boundary between inside and outside. So the file taps into something deep. The transcript narrator occasionally asks whether the biology described is internally consistent. He wonders about energy, metabolism, why certain organs would exist. These questions matter because a real organism is a system. If you change one part, you must change others. Alien biology in fiction often forgets this. It creates a feature because it is cool. It does not pay the cost. The EBO file tries to pay some costs. That is why it feels serious. But the costs it pays are mostly conceptual, not experimental. It does not give you raw data. It does not give you images. It does not give you sequences. If someone truly studied an organism at a molecular level, they would have details that are hard to fake. Sequences, motifs, specific assays, specific anomalies. The file offers suggestions, but not artifacts. So in Chapter 3, we do something gentle. We acknowledge the spell, and we keep our distance. We allow ourselves to feel the fascination. But we do not turn fascination into belief. We also note something else. This story is not only about aliens. It is about the human desire to locate intelligence outside ourselves. If something is watching, if something is guiding, if something is designing bodies, then maybe our chaos has an author. That desire is understandable, and it is also dangerous, because when we want an author, we will accept a fake manuscript. So the archive lights another candle. We keep reading, we keep asking, and we remember. A good story can be a mirror. It can show us what we fear, what we hope, what we are ready to believe. Chapter 4. Purpose, engineering, and motive. Now the file shifts from biology into purpose. It asks, implicitly, why this organism exists, why it was made, why it was here. Purpose is where stories become theology. The author suggests a framework. They hint at a larger system, a hierarchy, a program. They imply that the organism is not an individual in the way we are individuals. It might be a tool, a worker, a manufactured unit. This is where the story becomes modern, because we live in a world of tools that pretend to be individuals. We talk to software that sounds like a person. We watch machines write text. We watch algorithms choose what we see. So the idea of a biological tool is not distant, it is near. The file also suggests that the organism has limited autonomy, that it might be controlled, that it might be part of a larger intelligence. These are classic science fiction themes: the drone, the hive, the manufactured worker, but they also fit with certain interpretations of human institutions, because institutions can make drones, not by editing genes, by editing incentives, by editing fear, and the file seems to understand that. It describes scientists in the program as both curious and numb. They run experiments, they fill out forms, they obey. If the story is fiction, it is social realism. It understands how people can participate in secrecy without needing to be villains. They just need to be tired, need to have mortgages, need to have ambition, need to believe they are doing something important, Now we ask about the narrator in your transcript. Why is he reading this? Why is it compelling to an audience? Partly, it is because the file offers a new shape of alien, not a spiritual angel, not a demonic trickster, but a bioengineered product. That alien fits our era. We fear corporate power. We fear hidden labs. We fear that some things are being built beyond public control, so the file lands in a prepared mind. There is another reason it works. It provides a moral position. The author is framed as a reluctant insider, a person who cannot live with silence. This is a heroic structure. It lets the reader feel aligned with truth, but heroic structures are easy to counterfeit. So we ask again, what would be the incentives? Incentives to fabricate attention, status, the thrill of creating a myth, incentives to leak, guilt, fear, a desire to warn. Both exist. Then the file introduces another possibility. It suggests that within the program there are factions. Some believe the organism is one thing, some believe another. Factional stories are persuasive because they resemble reality. Real organizations have disagreements, but factional stories also serve a narrative purpose. They allow contradictions to be framed as politics. If the story changes, it is because factions lied. This is another shield. Now we come to the question of evidence. If this program existed, would it have remained secret? The file suggests it can, because it is embedded in legitimate structures. It suggests funding routes. It suggests compartmentalization. But secrecy at scale is hard. The more people involved, the more leaks occur. History shows that secrets do leak, sometimes quickly, sometimes decades later. So the story must balance. It must be big enough to be exciting, but small enough to be believable. The EBO file tries to do this by focusing on one facility, one organism, one scientist. It narrows the frame, and narrowing is persuasive. It makes the thing feel manageable. In Chapter 4, we start to understand what the file truly is. It is not just a claim about a body. It is a claim about a relationship between those who know and those who are kept from knowing. That relationship is real in many domains. So the file taps into a real wound, the wound of distrust. When people distrust institutions, they become hungry for alternative explanations. And alternative explanations often arrive as stories. So whether the EBO file is true or not, it functions. It functions as a narrative medicine for distrust. It says, you feel locked out because you are locked out, and that is why it spreads. In the archive, we do not swallow medicine without reading the label, so we keep going. Chapter 5. Belief, doubt, and the shape of evidence. Now the story brushes against the edge of the metaphysical, not with ghosts, with implications. If an engineered organism exists, then someone engineered it. And if someone engineered it, then intelligence exists beyond us. That idea can be thrilling. It can also be humiliating. Humans have spent centuries trying to place ourselves at the top of the ladder. Even when we deny ladders, we build them. We compare. We rank. We measure. So an external intelligence destabilizes our ladder. The EBO file suggests a hierarchy. Perhaps the organism is a worker. Perhaps there are others. Perhaps the engineers are elsewhere. The transcript narrator reacts to this with a kind of careful fascination. He does not commit. He speculates. He pulls back. And here we can add something important. Speculation is natural. But in the online world, speculation often hardens into belief. A person says, maybe. Another person hears, definitely. So the archive uses a slow voice to keep maybes as maybes, In Chapter 5, we also ask about the human characters. The author describes colleagues. Some are zealous, some are fearful, some are cynical. This is believable because people respond differently to strange work. In real labs, you meet the person who cannot stop talking about the project, the person who hates the project but stays, the person who believes the project is a moral mission. If the story is fabricated, these characters can still be drawn from life. Now we look at the rhetorical structure. The file offers a steady escalation: recruitment, training, access, samples, anatomy, purpose. Escalation is a storytelling technique. A real experience might be messier. A real experience might have dead ends, months of nothing, failed experiments, bureaucratic delays. The file does include boredom, but it does not include enough failure. In science, failure is constant. So when a story about science reads too clean, we notice. The author also makes claims about what the program knows, what it has concluded. In real biology, conclusions are tentative. When a person says, "We know this for sure," a scientist usually asks, based on what? The foil sometimes speaks with too much certainty, yet it also includes caveats. This is another technique. A caveat can create the impression of honesty. Now we ask about the broader ecosystem. The EBO file is not alone. It sits among many modern myths. UFO videos, leaked documents, whistleblower interviews, government hearings. In that ecosystem, people are primed. A primed mind does not require strong evidence. It requires a story that fits the existing frame. And the EBO file fits. It offers a biomedical flavor. It sounds like the inside of a lab. That is novel in the alien genre. Many older alien stories are military, pilots, radar, crash retrievals. This one is molecular. It is tissues and assays. That novelty is a competitive advantage. Now we do something that the internet rarely does. We imagine the mundane alternative explanations. A person could write this as fiction. A person could write this as a composite of rumors. A person could write this as a psychological experiment. A person could also write this as a kind of art. We live in a world where attention is currency. Art that produces attention can be rewarded even if it is dishonest. So the motive to create a convincing fake is not rare, but the motive to tell an uncomfortable truth is also real. So we remain suspended. The archive is a place for suspended judgment. In Chapter 5, we begin to understand what we are truly studying. Not aliens, but the anatomy of belief. Belief is built from hunger, from distrust, from fascination, from pattern recognition. Belief is built from the feeling that the official story is incomplete. Sometimes the official story is incomplete. Sometimes the incomplete story becomes a doorway for anything. So we keep our pace, we keep our questions, and we prepare for the last chapter. Because in the end, every archive must close the file. Not with certainty, with a final way of holding the story. Chapter 6, Closing the Folder. In the last movement, we do not try to win, we try to land. The EBO file, as read and discussed in your transcript, leaves the listener with a particular feeling. A feeling of being near something important. A feeling of being excluded. A feeling of being invited. That combination is powerful. It is how recruitment works. It is how cults work. It is how marketing works. You are told there is more. You are told you are the kind of person who can handle it. The file flatters the reader, not directly, but by offering a complicated narrative. If you understand this, you are smart. If you feel this, you are awake. That is an intoxicating offer. So our final task is to detox, not by mocking, by clarifying. Here is what we can say without pretending. The EBO file is a piece of testimony. It does not include artifacts. It does not include verifiable identifiers. It does not include raw data. That does not make it false. It makes it unconfirmed. In the world of science, unconfirmed claims are not useless. They are prompts. They are hypotheses. They are invitations to test. But in the world of the internet, unconfirmed claims are often treated like conclusions. So we separate the domains. If someone wanted to move this story toward truth, what would they do? They would provide verifiable details. They would provide a chain of custody. They would provide data that is expensive to fake. Until then, the story remains an artifact of culture. And cultural artifacts matter because they show us where the collective mind is turning. The EBO file shows that our alien stories are evolving. They are becoming administrative, procedural, scientific. They are becoming less like folklore and more like paperwork. That is not an accident. We are living in an age where power often hides behind process, behind compliance, behind forms. So our myths adapt. The monster learns to wear a badge. And maybe that is the quiet lesson. Even if there are no engineered organisms in a basement lab, there are still worlds inside worlds. There are still programs you cannot see. There are still decisions made beyond the public eye. Sometimes those programs are ordinary. Sometimes they are unethical. Sometimes they are simply too complex to explain in a headline. And when people feel locked out, they will seek other narratives. So the archive does not end by declaring true or false. It ends by describing the feeling the story creates, and by offering a safer way to hold that feeling. You can be curious without being captured. You can be open without being gullible. You can admit that the world contains secrets without letting every secret story become a new religion. And if you love the idea of alien life, you do not need this file to love it. The universe is already strange. We already live on a rock that learned to sing. We already carry a library of ancient code inside every cell. That is real. So we do not have to force a myth into certainty. We can let it remain what it is: a document, a performance, a possibility, an object in the quiet archive. And now, we close the folder. But before we do, we take one more slow walk around the table. Not to argue, not to convince, just to make the shape of the story clear. When a scientific claim is real, it leaves a trail. Not a poetic trail, a procedural one. A trail you can follow even if you do not like the person who made it. There are dates. There are instruments. There are lab notebooks. There are file hashes. There are emails. There are raw outputs. There are repeated failures. There are messy revisions. There are people who disagree and still agree on what the machines measured. The EBO file gives us the feeling of a trail without most of the trail. It gives us the smell of bleach, the sense of gloves, the hum of freezers. It gives us an office tone, but it does not give us the hard, boring artifacts that make science more than narration. This is important to say plainly. A story can be written by someone with real expertise. A story can also be written by someone who has never stepped into a lab, but has spent enough time reading protocols to borrow the costume. The costume includes certain words: biosafety, assays, culture conditions, sterility, controls. Those words are not magic. They do not certify the speaker. So how do we read? We read in layers. First layer, internal consistency. Does the story contradict itself? Does it change its own rules? Does it forget what it said earlier. Second layer, external consistency. Do the claims match what we already know about biology, about logistics, about the way institutions operate? Third layer, cost of fabrication. What would be hard to fake? What would be expensive to fake? What would require access? The EBO file stays mostly in the first two layers. It tries to be internally consistent. It tries to be externally plausible. It avoids the third layer. That does not mean it is false. It means it stays in the zone where story is cheap. Now, there is a quiet counterpoint. Sometimes people cannot provide artifacts because artifacts would identify them, because artifacts would be classified, because the artifact itself is the thing that gets you put in a courtroom. This is real. So the absence of artifacts is not a slam of the gavel. It is a weight. It is one of the weights we place on the scale. Another weight is the way the file talks about institutions. The writer seems to understand bureaucracy, and that is a kind of truth. Large programs are not made of genius. They are made of meetings. They are made of personnel issues. They are made of procurement. They are made of risk management. They are made of people forgetting passwords, people mislabeling samples, people missing deadlines, people going home exhausted. A story that includes none of that is usually fantasy. This file includes some of it. It includes boredom. It includes rules. It includes paperwork. It includes the quiet hostility of being told to stay in your lane. Those details could come from real experience. They could also come from careful observation of any restrictive workplace. A hospital, a defense contractor, a pharmaceutical lab. So again, we do not crown it. We also ask about the reader's role. When you listen to this story, you are not only consuming information, you are participating. You are entering a community of listeners, a community that reacts, comments, shares, builds theories. This community can become an engine. It can reward the most extreme interpretation. It can punish caution. It can turn uncertainty into accusation. And that is why the tone of the transcript matters. The narrator is not a perfect shield. No one is. But his pauses and doubts are a kind of public health. In an era where attention is monetized, doubt is a scarce resource. Now, one of the most interesting parts of the EBO file is the way it reframes the alien. For decades, aliens in popular culture were mostly spiritual or military. They were visitors in lights. They were beings that made presidents tremble. They were gods in a shiny suit. But the EBO file gives us an alien that fits a lab bench. It makes the alien mundane. And this is where the story becomes a mirror, because we are living through a time when biology itself is becoming a field of design. We can already do things that would have sounded like alien magic to our grandparents. We can edit genes, we can grow organoids, we can print scaffolds, we can map cell types, we can read sequences at scale. We can do this imperfectly. We can do it with limitations. We can do it with frequent failure. But the direction is clear. So when the EBO file says the alien looks engineered, it does not feel like fantasy. It feels like a projection of our own path. This is how myths evolve. A myth takes the technology of its era and uses it as the vocabulary for the unknown. Ancient myths used fire, wheels, storms. Industrial myths used electricity, engines, factories. Our myths use code, networks, biology as software. So the EBO file is not only a claim, it is a cultural symptom. It shows that our imagination is now trained on labs, on basement facilities, on secret programs hidden inside legitimate infrastructure. This is not irrational. Many real unethical programs have existed, History offers examples, so skepticism must be careful. A person can be wrong about aliens and still be right that institutions can harm. So we hold two truths at once. One, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Two, ordinary institutions can do extraordinary damage. Now, let's speak softly about the experience of being a listener. When you listen to a story like this, something happens to time. The world narrows. You picture the corridors, the badge, the freezer room. You imagine the moment when a person stands in front of a sealed container and realizes they are looking at something that does not belong in any textbook. That imagined moment is intoxicating. It is the fantasy of discovery, and discovery is one of the most beautiful human drives. So it is not shameful to feel pulled. It is natural. The danger is when the pull becomes possession, when the story becomes identity, when the listener becomes a soldier for the story. That is when communities fracture. That is when families argue. That is when people begin to treat friends like enemies, not because of evidence, but because of alignment. So the archive invites a different practice. Practice curiosity without becoming a weapon. Practice skepticism without becoming cruel. Practice wonder without surrender. Now, if you wanted to evaluate the EBO file more rigorously, what could you do? You could collect every concrete claim, every date, every named method, every described protocol. Then you could ask experts, not influencers, not people chasing clicks, working scientists, people who live in the slow world of peer review. You could ask them a simple question. Does this sound like someone doing this work? Or does it sound like someone writing about it? You could also ask a different question. Where are the mistakes? Real lab work produces mistakes. In real notebooks, you see crossed out numbers. You see variations. You see frustration. You see the confession that an experiment failed because the incubator was off. A story with no mistakes is often too polished. So you would look for that. You would also look for the things the author does not mention. Waste streams, permits, procurement, supply chain, vendor relationships. These are unglamorous, but they are unavoidable. Even secret programs buy gloves. Even secret programs dispose of sharps. Even secret programs have HVAC. If a story wants to be plausible, it should respect the ugliness of logistics. The EBO file respects some logistics. It does not respect enough. Again, not a verdict, a weight. Now, consider another possibility. Sometimes the most persuasive hoaxes are made by people who have lived near the truth. Not inside a secret alien lab, but inside a lab, inside a hospital, inside a restricted facility. They know the cadence. They know the rules. Then they add one impossible ingredient. This is like making a stew. If the base tastes real, the spice can be strange. So we hold that possibility. We also hold the possibility that the author is sincere. Sincerity does not guarantee accuracy. A person can be sincerely wrong. A person can interpret an unknown sample as alien. A person can be fed a story by colleagues. A person can be used. Institutions can create myths internally. Rumors inside a closed system can become truths because no one can challenge them. So even if the EBO file were produced by an insider, it could still be a story that grew inside the program, a story the author believes. This is one of the darkest things about secrecy. Secrecy does not just hide reality, it breeds alternate realities. People fill gaps with narrative. In a closed system, narrative can become the air. Now look at the broader culture. Why do so many people want this to be true? Some want it because it would mean we are not alone. Some want it because it would mean the governments of the world are hiding something, and being right about that would feel like power. Some want it because they are tired of ordinary life. A secret alien program turns the world back into a myth. It makes the streetlight outside your window feel like it might be watching. It makes your daily routine feel like a disguise. That is intoxicating. But there is also a softer reason. People want a bigger story because the current story feels thin. They want meaning. They want the feeling that behind the noise of politics and bills and tired mornings, there is something immense. So the archive offers a reminder. You do not need a hoax to have immensity. You can look at a microscope and see a city. You can look at a night sky and see an ocean. You can look at your own body and see a billion-year chain of survival. That is real. So the archive does not try to steal wonder from you. It tries to relocate it. Wonder belongs in reality. When wonder is trapped inside unconfirmed stories, it becomes fragile. It becomes defensiveness. It becomes anger. So we release it. Now we return to the title of our episode, Anatomy. A body is made of systems. So is a story. The EBO file has bones. The bones are bureaucracy. It has muscle. The muscle is technical language. It has blood. The blood is fear. It has skin. The skin is plausibility. It has a nervous system. The nervous system is the internet. And like many bodies, it can move even without a soul. Because a story does not need truth to live. It needs circulation. So our final statement is simple. Treat this file like an artifact. Study it. Do not worship it. If more evidence emerges one day, you can update. If it collapses under scrutiny, you can let it go. That flexibility is a strength. It is what keeps the mind alive. There is also one more thing to notice. The file does something that many modern internet texts do. It anticipates your objections. It tries to meet you at the doorway. It says, I know you will doubt. I know you will look for inconsistencies. I know you will ask why there is no proof. And then it offers explanations in advance. This is rhetorically strong. It is how persuasive writing works. A writer who can name your doubts can reduce their power. But it is also a risk marker, because honest accounts do not always come pre-armored. Sometimes honest accounts are clumsy. Sometimes they are incomplete. Sometimes the person telling the truth does not know how to protect their own story. A well-armored story can be a sign of craft, and craft can belong to truth or to fiction. So we ask a careful question. Where does the armor appear? It appears most strongly around identity. The author says they will be vague. They say they will be inconsistent. They say they will insert red herrings. That is plausible. But it also means we cannot check. Now we ask another careful question. If you were an insider who wanted the public to know, what would you prioritize? You might prioritize proof. You might prioritize safety. You might prioritize a channel that protects you. In the modern world, there are leak channels. There are investigative journalists. There are whistleblower protections of varying strength. There are lawyers. None of these are perfect, but they exist. A person who truly possessed world-changing evidence might try to use them, or they might not. Fear can paralyze, but fear also has a pattern. Fear does not usually produce a polished narrative. Fear produces fragments. Fear produces delays. Fear produces contradictions that feel accidental, not strategic. So again, we do not decide. We notice. Now we talk gently about another element. Community feedback. When a story like this spreads, it is rarely the story alone. It becomes a collaborative object. People annotate, they argue, they propose corrections, they add interpretations. Over time, the story can evolve. This is how folklore works. And this matters because the version you heard in the transcript is already part of that evolution. It is the file plus the narrator's tone, plus his pauses, plus his commentary, plus the comment section's response. So when you evaluate the EBO file, you are evaluating a living organism, a mimetic organism. It adapts to survive. If someone points out a weakness, a new interpretation patches it. If someone demands proof, a new argument explains why proof is impossible. If someone says it sounds like fiction, a new post lists reasons it sounds like truth. This is not evil, it is natural, but it can make a story harder to falsify because the story is no longer one claim. It becomes a cloud of claims. So the archive suggests a technique. Freeze the story. Write down what is actually said. Separate it from what people wish it said. Separate it from what people add. That is how you return from myth to analysis. Now, we can apply that technique lightly. What is actually said? A scientist claims to have worked in a compartmentalized program. They claim to have encountered an organism. They claim certain biological properties. They claim an institutional culture. They imply certain motives. That is the core. Everything else is interpretation. Now ask what would be required to verify even one piece. You do not have to verify the alien. You can verify the workplace. For example, could an independent journalist verify that a certain facility exists? Could they verify a pattern of unusual hiring? Could they verify a funding stream? Could they verify that a certain person with a certain background disappeared into a certain job? These are not easy, but they are easier than verifying an alien. And they are the kinds of things real investigations do. So one of the quiet disappointments of the modern attention economy is that we often skip the middle work. We jump from story to belief, or from story to dismissal. We do not do the slow, patient, unglamorous middle. The archive honors the middle. Now, another note. Sometimes a story like this is a probe, not a probe from aliens, a probe from humans. A writer posts something convincing to see who reacts, to see what people believe, to see who will share, to see what the culture is hungry for. If that is the case, the EBO file is less a confession and more a measurement of the era. And that is why it may have the texture of realism. Because the goal is not to tell a bedtime story. The goal is to create a signal. Now, you might ask, what if it is true? What if the organism exists? What if the program exists? Then what? The answer is not simple. Because if it were true, it would not mean only that life exists elsewhere. It would mean that we have been in contact. It would mean that certain institutions have managed information at a world historical level. It would mean ethical questions. It would mean questions about consent, about who decides what humanity knows. It would mean questions about danger, because contact is not only wonder, contact is risk, pathogens, power, misinterpretation. So even in the true scenario, the story would not be pure awe. It would be an uncomfortable human story. And that is another reason the file feels plausible. It does not present the program as a paradise. It presents it as a bureaucracy under strain. That is how humans handle the extraordinary. We wrap it in forms. We wrap it in policy. We wrap it in meetings. We wrap it in fear. So if the story were true, the outline could look like this. Now, if the story is false, what then? Then it is still an artifact. it is still a lens. It shows the shape of modern belief. It shows how we have learned to trust the tone of expertise. It shows how we have learned to distrust official silence. It shows how we have learned to seek meaning in leaks. That is not embarrassing. It is human. Humans have always listened for whispers behind the wall. We are pattern seekers. We are story builders. We are not designed to live inside pure uncertainty. So we build bridges. Sometimes those bridges connect us to truth. Sometimes they connect us to fantasy. So the archive offers one final gentle practice. When you feel the pull of a story, name the pull. Say it out loud, even if only to yourself. I want this to be true, or I want this to be false, or I want to be the kind of person who saw it first, or I want the world to be bigger. Naming the pull does not kill the story. It just stops the story from steering without you. That is the difference between curiosity and capture. Now, if you are the kind of person who loves the scientific angle, you can do something constructive. You can learn what real biology looks like, not the polished version. The real version. You can read papers. You can watch talks. You can learn how uncertain most conclusions are. You can learn how often results fail. You can learn how often the most important discoveries arrive sideways. Then, when a story like the EBO file appears, you will have a stronger internal compass. Not because you will be immune, but because you will recognize the difference between a claim and a data set, between a tone and a method, between a narrative and an experiment. And if you are the kind of person who loves the human angle, you can also do something constructive. You can learn how institutions behave, how secrecy changes incentives, how compartmentalization changes trust, how people rationalize participation. Then you will understand why a story about a locked-down lab feels so believable. Because it rhymes with many smaller truths. Before we leave, we add one practical thing. How do you talk about a story like this with other people? If you bring it up like a weapon, it becomes a fight. If you bring it up like a confession, it becomes a loyalty test. A gentler approach is to treat it like a film you watched. You can say, I heard this story. It was convincing. It had a lot of procedural detail. You can say, I do not know if it is true, but it made me think about secrecy and science. You can ask, what parts feel plausible to you? You can ask, what kind of evidence would you need? If the other person believes strongly, you do not have to humiliate them. You can simply ask for their best piece of evidence, not 10 links, one strongest piece. Then you can talk about what it is, a story, a testimony, a clip, a document. You can separate the feeling from the claim. You can say, I understand why it feels real. And you can say, I want it to be real too. But I also want to be careful. This keeps the conversation human. It also keeps your relationships intact, because the internet trains people to trade relationships for arguments. The archive prefers the opposite. Keep relationships. Hold arguments lightly. Wait for evidence. That is a quiet strength. Before we leave, we can place the story in a longer timeline. Every era has its hidden rooms. In the Cold War, hidden rooms were missile silos and listening stations. In the early internet era, hidden rooms were server closets and anonymous forums. In our era, hidden rooms are often imagined as labs. Labs feel like places where the rules of the world can be rewritten. They are places where invisible things become visible. A virus becomes a sequence. A cell becomes a map. A protein becomes a shape. So when someone says there is a hidden lab beneath a legitimate facility, the mind accepts the setting. It is already plausible that extraordinary work happens behind access control. What is being asked is not that secrecy exists. What is being asked is that the secret is alien. And that leap is the one we cannot make on mood. We need evidence. Still, it helps to understand why the leap is tempting. Aliens are not only creatures in our stories, they are a way of talking about distance, about the feeling that reality has layers, about the feeling that the people in charge are not quite human, about the feeling that the future is arriving from somewhere else. So even if the EBO file is a fabrication, it is not random. It is tuned. It is tuned to the frequency of the age, a frequency made of distrust, awe, and fatigue. So we do not treat the listener as foolish. We treat the listener as human, a human trying to locate truth and meaning. Now, with that kindness in place, skepticism becomes easier. Because skepticism is hardest when it feels like an insult. The archive avoids insult. It offers a different identity. Not believer, not debunker. Witness. A witness can say, I saw the story. A witness can say, the story moved me. A witness can say, I do not yet know if it is real. That is an honorable position. And from that position, you can wait for evidence. You can watch how the story changes. You can watch who profits. You can watch what new claims are attached. You can watch whether any hard artifacts appear. And if no artifacts appear, you can let the story fade without bitterness. Because you did not build your identity on it. You simply observed it. Before we leave, we can also look at the language itself. The EBO file uses a voice that tries to be restrained. It does not scream. It does not shout. It speaks as if it is documenting. That restraint is persuasive. Because people associate restraint with seriousness. A person who is lying, we imagine, will be dramatic. But a skilled liar can be calm. And a truthful person can be emotional. So we should not use mood as a detector. Instead, we notice technique. The file uses hedges in strategic places. It uses phrases like, to my knowledge. It uses phrases like, I cannot say. It uses phrases like, I was not cleared. These hedges can be authentic. They can also be a way of avoiding falsifiable claims. The file also uses the language of procedure. It mentions how rooms are entered. It mentions the flow of samples. It mentions the division of tasks. This creates the feeling of reality, because reality is procedural, and fiction, when it wants to be believed, borrows procedure. Now, consider the audience. Many listeners are not biologists. Most listeners cannot check the technical claims directly, so they rely on cues, tone, specificity, confidence. The EBO file is built out of cues, so the honest way to approach it is to admit what you cannot evaluate. If you cannot verify the technical claims, you can still evaluate structure. You can still ask whether the story behaves like a responsible account. Does it encourage verification? Does it invite independent scrutiny? Does it provide paths to confirmation? Or does it mainly ask you to trust the voice? The file mostly asks you to trust the voice. Again, not a verdict. A wait. Now, consider how the story handles uncertainty. In science, uncertainty is normal. It is not embarrassing. It is the default state. A scientist says, I think. A scientist says, our data suggests. A scientist says, more work is needed. The EBO file sometimes speaks like this, but it also sometimes speaks like a person who wants to be remembered. That desire to be remembered can exist in whistleblowers. It can also exist in authors. So we keep our pace. We listen. We take notes. We do not rush. We allow the story to remain what it is in this moment. an object of attention, a cultural document, a possible warning, a possible fabrication, a possible mixture. One last slow note before we leave. When people argue about stories like this online, they often argue as if the only options are worship or ridicule, believe completely, or mock completely. That is a false choice. A healthy mind has more positions. You can say, I do not know. You can say, I doubt this, but I want to understand why it feels persuasive. You can say, I am open to evidence, but I will not accept tone as evidence. These positions are quieter. They do not perform well in comment sections, but they are where real thinking lives. If you want a small checklist for the next time a document like this crosses your screen, here is one you can carry without effort. Ask, what is the claim? What is the strongest piece of supporting evidence? What is the weakest point? What would change my mind? What would I accept as confirmation? What would I accept as disconfirmation? These questions are simple. They are also rare because they require you to decide what you value more, being right or being honest. Now there is another layer to this archive story. The EBO file is not only about an alien body, it is about an alien feeling. The feeling that something is being done without you. That a door exists and you are not allowed through. That someone else knows what the world really is. This feeling is common now. It is not only about UFOs. It appears in politics, in economics, in technology, in medicine. People feel managed. They feel processed. They feel like a number. So a story that says, yes, there is a hidden program, can feel like emotional confirmation. It turns a vague sense of exclusion into a specific image. A basement lab, a badge, a freezer, a lawyer, and an NDA. This is the psychological service the story provides. And it is why the story can remain powerful, even if it is false. Because it answers an emotional question, not a scientific one. The emotional question is, why does the world feel controlled? The story answers, because it is. So in the archive, we try to answer more carefully. Sometimes the world feels controlled because it is complex, because many systems operate at scales we cannot see. Sometimes it feels controlled because institutions actually do hide information. Sometimes it feels controlled because we are exhausted and our attention has been harvested. All of these can be true without aliens. So the archive does not need the EBO file to be true in order to take the feeling seriously. It takes the feeling seriously and then refuses to let the feeling decide what is real. That is the discipline. And that discipline is not cold. It is protective. It protects you from being used by hoaxers, used by grifters, used by your own hunger. Now, when you hear the phrase anatomy of an alien, you might imagine a body on a table. But there is another anatomy here, the anatomy of a leak, the anatomy of a myth, the anatomy of a modern mind trying to locate truth in a noisy world. And that is why this story belongs in the quiet archive, not because it is confirmed, because it is revealing. There is no shame in being drawn to a mystery. Mystery is one of the oldest human pleasures. But there is a difference between mystery and confusion. Mystery is a door you can choose to open slowly. Confusion is a fog that opens the door for anyone. So the archive keeps one small lamp lit. The lamp is method. Method is not only for scientists, it is for anyone who wants to keep their mind their own. Method is asking for the chain. Who says this? Based on what? How do we know? What would contradict it? If you carry those questions, you can listen to anything. You can listen to the EBO file. You can listen to the reactions. You can listen to your own imagination, and you will not be lost. Now we turn off the lights. We leave the basement. And as we go, we remember that the internet is a machine that turns uncertainty into content. It rewards the loudest interpretation. It rewards the most shocking summary. It rewards certainty, even when certainty is not earned. So the archive asks for a slower reward, the reward of staying honest, the reward of saying, "I do not know yet," the reward of being able to update without shame. If one day someone produces real evidence that changes this story, you can welcome it. If one day the story dissolves under scrutiny, you can let it go. In both cases, you will still be you, curious, careful, alive. We step back into the ordinary world, and the ordinary world, if you look closely, is not ordinary at all. It is full of hidden processes, full of machines you cannot see, full of microscopic lives, full of decisions made far away, full of quiet patterns. So maybe the best thing a story like this can do is sharpen your attention, not toward fantasies, toward the world you actually inhabit, the world where truth is hard and still worth seeking, where wonder is real and does not need permission, where secrecy exists and accountability still matters, and where you can stay curious without being taken. And we notice that the ordinary world is still full of unanswered questions. This was a quiet archive story where the story ends, sleep begins,